In this chapter, we'll see how to implement another advanced component from the Kendo UI library, the Kendo Grid. One of our new requirements for the RPS Project Tracker version 2 list of backlog items is to make it pageable and sortable. The Kendo Grid can handle these features as well as over 100 other features, including filtering, grouping, and editing. You can find the documentation about all the features of the grid in the Kendo docs. Because the grid is so configurable and there are so many features, I suggest having the site open while you develop so that you can use it for reference. While the grid can be data bound to local or remote data, in this chapter we'll be working with local data. We'll set up the grid and configure it to display our backlog items, and then we'll add paging and sorting. In the chapter on the Kendo chart, you saw how easy it was to add a chart to our page. Well, the workflow with the grid is going to be very similar. Let's take a look at the existing state of the application and what we're trying to accomplish. First of all, let's head over to the backlog page. And here you'll see a list of backlog items going all the way down the page. This is what we want to turn into a pageable grid. Right now it's just a table, an HTML table. This table is filterable by either My Items, Open Items, or Done Items. Our table is not sortable or pageable, so these are things we want to add. We want to retain this filtering as well, and we want the filtering to be represented in the URL so that we can deep link into, let's say, My Items, for example. So we want the grid to be integrated into our page and keep all the existing functionality in place. Let's take a look at the completed application. This is what we want the grid to look like in the end. So let's take a look at Open Items. You can see that in the URL, we have a preset of Open selected. And if I go to Done Items, the preset is closed, and this updates and refreshes our data. We're also able to sort the grid. For example, here I'm sorting by title ascending, title descending, and we also have paging capabilities. Let's head over to the documentation. You'll see the grid section here. This will give you some simple examples that you can start with for basic column setup and data source setup. One thing we're not going to cover is creating a grid directly from an HTML table. That's something you can read about in this section right here. So if you already have an existing HTML table, you can simply call Kendo Grid on it, like this, and it'll convert the existing table into a Kendo Grid. This is simple enough to do that you can try this on your own. We're going to look at a more complex example now. So let's go to the code and add the grid. We want to go to the page backlog because that's the page where our grid is going to live, and open up backlog.html. I'm going to collapse this modal dialog and let's head up a little bit. This right here is where our responsive table lives. This is the table that displays our current items. It's this table that I will be replacing. So instead of this whole div here, I'm going to delete this and I'm going to create a new div with an ID of grid to keep it simple. And that's all we need to do in our HTML. Let's open up the index file, which helps out the HTML. And let's scroll all the way up to the top where we're doing our imports. Here where you have the Progress Kendo UI Kendo dropdown list imported. We just need to import the grid now, which is coming from Progress Kendo UI JS Kendo.grid. I want to mention this again, that while we have simple components that can come from Kendo Core, the Kendo Grid and the Kendo chart are Pro components. So in order to use the grid, you need the Pro package of Kendo UI from Progress. That's the package that I'm using here. Once this is imported, we can start using it right away. Here we are in the jQuery document ready event. This is where we're initializing our Kendo components as well as our regular jQuery components. And this is where I'll initialize the grid. Let's go down here to the bottom, and I'm going to use a jQuery selector to select our grid by ID. And I'm going to call Kendo Grid on it. This will create this as a grid. Now, just like all our other Kendo components, the Kendo Grid function can also take in options. So I'm going to create a constant up here that's going to contain our grid options. I'm going to call it PT Grid Options. The most important one right now is the data source. So let's go ahead and create the data source property as an object. It's going to have data in it, and this is just going to be an empty array for now. We're going to be updating this data when our data model updates with the new items. So let's pass these grid options into our Kendo Grid. And now we need to get a hold of the actual grid instance. The way we've been doing that in this course so far is just by using the data function and passing along what type we want to get back. In this case, we want the Kendo Grid. So this will return to us the actual Kendo Grid instance that we can later alter and pass the updated data So I'm going to save this into a variable called ptgrid, which I need to create up here. And I'm going to initialize it to null. Now, if we come down here, we have our items here. These are the items that get updated every time we do some kind of filtering operation. Right now, this is trying to update our table, which is the HTML table. We no longer have that table, but this won't do anything if there is no table detected. So this is exactly the place that we're also going to be updating our grid data. But before we do that, we want to make sure that items is not null or undefined and that our ptgrid instance is not null or undefined. And only then we're going to go into the ptgrid and update the data source data with the new items. This is enough to actually render our data and render our grid. Let's go take a look. So I'm just going to click on some filters here, and you'll see that our grid is being updated with the data. But these columns aren't really good looking, and we're showing too many columns here. We don't want to show all these columns. We're also showing some objects that the Kendo Grid doesn't really know how to render. It is doing a pretty good job in trying to guess what we want to render. It's assigning the headers for this table based on the property names for each object. And some of the properties, like simple numbers and simple strings, it's doing a good job of rendering. But we're going to come back and fix this by defining columns and how we want the columns to look. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at column definitions, where we're going to be able to control how each column renders and which columns to show. So far, we have data appearing in the grid, but we're letting the grid automatically determine how it should display the data. And while it's good at doing that, for the most part, some of the data it doesn't know how to display. So we're going to be controlling this by defining the columns that we want to display and defining how we want those columns to be displayed. Let's head over to the code and let's go down to where we're initially defining the grid with the grid options right down here. And one of the options we can pass in is columns. This is going to be an array of grid columns, which are going to be used to define the columns. And we're going to start off by defining one column. That's the simplest one. So this object takes in a mapping between the field or the name of the property of the item. So field is going to be title. And just by doing that, if we take a look at the grid now, you'll see that the grid is displaying one column. And these are all the items that we have, and their titles are being listed here. Notice that it's pulling in the name for the header from the property name itself. So it's automatically guessing that, which is doing a pretty good job. But we can control that. We can specify the title to be title with an uppercase. And now that title is uppercased. There are too many title words here, so let's give a better example. We'll use the field estimate. So estimate is the property name of the PT item. And we'll give it a title of estimate, capitalized. And we can even control the width of the column here. So I'm going to say the width of the column will be 100, which is 100 pixels. Let's take a look. So now we have a title column and we have an estimate column. You can see that the estimate column is just numbers, so we don't really need to control the way that's displayed. It looks fine. And this column is 100 pixels wide. I'm going to give you an exercise now. Let's take a look at the completed application. We have so far added the title column and we've added the estimate column. I want you to try and add the rest of these columns in. This is not going to be as straightforward as you might think. The first column is the type column, and we have an image displayed there. The second one is the assignee, where we have the name, which you can pretty easily get from the object, but we also have this avatar. The priority column has these priorities, but they have bootstrap badge styling, and I recommend you start off with the created date column. This one should be a simple one. One hint I can give you is that if you go to the demo documentation and then grid, here you'll see a lot of examples of what we're trying to do, including this section down here called row template. This will give you an idea of how we want to implement these templates. Let's continue with defining our columns for the grid, but the rest of our columns need a little bit of a special touch. They're not just regular strings or numbers that we can display. They're going to require templates. If you've done the exercise from the previous lesson, you might have taken advantage of the row template documentation that you found in the demos for the grid. Let's do this together, and we're going to start off with an easy one, and that's the date column. So right over here, I'm going to define the field that we want to use, and that's the date created field. The title I'm going to give it is shorter than date created. I'm just going to use the word created. And I'll also limit the width of this one to 160. Let's take a look. All right, so you can see that here we have a date, and it's being interpreted by the grid and printed out using just a regular toString probably. But that's not what we want to see. We want to see a short date displayed here. So there's another option we can provide for each of the columns here, and that's the template option. Now the grid will support different kinds of templating methods, including Kendo UI's own jQuery templates, which we talked about earlier in the course. But for this particular exercise, I'm going to use the function approach. So I'm going to create a new function called getCreatedDateMarkup, which will return the markup for the cell. There we go. And I'm going to copy this. Let's go up a little bit. Right before our document ready event, I'm going to create a new function called getCreatedDateMarkup. So the template function will pass me the item that's being rendered. So that's the entire row. So each row is going to be represented by one PT item. And here I need to return a string. Now I could just return item.dateCreated, and let's say I wanted to use toDateString. This is a string, and this will work. Let's take a look. So that fulfills our requirements. But what if we wanted to add a little bit more styling here? We can return a string from our template function, or we can return HTML. And in my case, I want to add a little bit of styling to this, so I'm going to return HTML. I'm going to use templated strings, and I'm going to return a span with a special class of li_date that I've previously defined. And inside the span, I'm just going to go ahead and drag this into there like that. Now, if I take a look, you can see that we still have that same date, but now we have slightly different styling. The font is a little bit smaller and it's purple color. All right, so if you're following along and you have a better understanding of templates, as an exercise, go ahead and try to implement the rest of the columns. All right, were you successful? If not, that's okay. Let's do this together now. I'm going to go down here to the definitions of my columns, and I'm going to define the rest of the columns, starting with type. That's going to be the first column. So I'm going to go up here and define the type column. And this one, I don't want it to have a title, but if I don't leave the title in, that column will automatically get the type name or the type heading like this. So if you don't want to have the heading for that column, you need to specify a blank for the title, an empty space. And now my column doesn't have a heading. We also want to convert all these types of issues into their image equivalents. Earlier in the course, we did this with the drop-down list. We need to use the same helper function here in our template. So first, I'm going to limit the width of this to just 45 because that's going to be enough to render our image. And then I'm going to provide a template. I'm going to call this function getItemTypeCellMarkup. Let's go up here. I'm going to create this function called getItemTypeCellMarkup. It's going to take in a PT item as a parameter and return a string just like we did before. And here I'm going to just paste in the image that it's going to return. Here's the HTML. It's an image with the source of getIndicatorImage. We've used this function earlier in the course. It has a class of backlog icon. Just in case you need a reminder, I'm going to press F12 here. And this basically uses the item type image res from type function, which returns to us an icon from the assets folder. And that's what our app looks like now, with all the icons there for each of the item types. All right, let's keep going. Just a couple more columns to do. The next column is assignee. I'm going to paste this one in. It's looking at the assignee field. The title is going to be assignee with the capital A, and the width is going to be 260. We're going to create this getAssignee_cell_markup function in a little bit. And one more, which is going to be the priority field right over here. Let's create these two template functions up here. I'm going to paste them in and let's quickly go over them. So here's getAssignee_cell_markup, which also takes in an item. But in this case, we want an object that comes with item, which is the assignee object. So I'm just going to save that off to user constant. So that way I can use user's properties inside my template. And this just returns a div with an image and some styling and a span for the full name. And here's getPriorityCellMarkup, which uses the Bootstrap badge and then calls the getIndicator class function, which we also saw earlier in the course when we were working on the details form and the drop-down lists. I'm going to hit F12 here so you can take a look. This will just return some class names based on the priority, and those class names have different colors. So I'm going to save this and let's take a look. Okay, wonderful. So we have all our columns already defined here, and it's looking very good, but I have to scroll all the way down here to the bottom, and I don't want to scroll the page. I want to make this grid itself scrollable if it's too long. So how do we do that? Let's go down here to the definition of the grid again. And after columns, I'm going to set a height for the grid. This will limit the overall height of the grid rendering on the page. and I'm going to set it to 410. So if you need to limit the grid only to a certain area of the page, this is a good way to do that. And here we go. Now my page doesn't have a scroll bar, but I can just scroll the grid independently. And that way I can still get to my filters up here. And notice that my filters still work. The only thing that doesn't work is clicking on one of these items to get to the details page. Let's take care of that real quick. So the grid also has a selectable property on it, which we need to set to true, which will allow us to select multiple rows of the grid if we wanted to. But really, we don't need to select multiple rows in our case. If you were to have a grid, let's say you have checkboxes in the grid, and you want to select multiple rows and then do some kind of operation with them, then you can do that. But for us, all we want to do is just make the grid selectable, and we want to listen for the change event. The change event will let us know that you've selected one row, and we want to respond to that. So I'm going to create a function called onGridChange, and this is the function that we're going to use to navigate to the details page. So let's go up here. I'm going to create a function called onGridChange. That takes in an event, and here we want to get a hold of the actual item that was tapped. And it took me a little bit to figure this out. But the way we get to the actual item that was tapped is by going through the grid instance. So ptGrid data item, and then we want to use the event, the sender on the event. Then we want to get the selected item. We want to convert that to JSON. So finally we get that item that we were looking for. This will give us the ID of the item, which is what we want to pass in to the details page. And if we go down here, you can take a look at this document onClick event where we're listening for clicks on the rows of the previous table. We can just copy this line right here. This is the line that we used to navigate when we used to have a table. So I'm going to copy that out because it's going to be the same line, and I'm going to paste it here. All we need to do is just change this to item.id. All right, let's take a look. Here's our grid. I'm going to tap on one of these items, and it navigates to the details page. Our navigation is working fine. There's still a few more things we need to do with the grid. We need to make it pageable and sortable. Now we need to make the grid pageable and sortable, just like we have in the final product. All right, let's go to the code and do this. It's not that difficult using Kendo UI for jQuery. I'm going to define a property called sortable, and I'm going to set it to true. What else do we need to do? Well, actually, nothing. It's already sortable. Look at this. If I tap on title, you can see our grid is being sorted. If I tap on estimate, our grid is being sorted by highest estimate to the lowest estimate. So that's pretty easy. What about pageability? This is not very difficult either. So I'm going to create a property called pageable, and this can be either a Boolean or a Kendo UI Grid pageable. Let's set this to true. Now, if we set this to true, this is not going to be pageable right away. It needs to know a few bits of information before it becomes fully pageable. First of all, we need to define a page size, but we do that here on the data source itself. So besides the data, I'm going to define a page size here. I'm going to make it 10. We want 10 items per page. And when I do that, now we're pageable and we have a total count of items and we can page through these items. The pager down here at the bottom of the grid also has a number of controls that you can alter. So for example, let's say we wanted to select how many items per page we wanted to show. Or if we wanted to have a refresh icon here so we can refresh the grid. That's useful in scenarios where you're fetching data from the server. And right here, we're showing 10 items here, 10 pages. What if we wanted to show less or more? We can control that. And the pageable property here can be either a Boolean or it can be a grid pageable. So if it's a grid pageable, it's an object that we can specify different options with. For example, button count. Let's say we wanted 3 buttons instead of the 10 that we saw there. So now here we have 1, 2, 3 instead of going all the way up to 10. We can turn on page sizes. The name of this one is a little bit confusing, but I'll show you what it does. If I set this to true, you'll get this little drop down right here where you can select how many items per page you want to show. So if I set that to 5, this will show only 5 items per page. If I set that to 20, you can see that we're displaying 1 through 20 and you need to scroll. And finally, if you are fetching data from the server, you can use the refresh icon for that. I'm going to set that to true and that'll create this little refresh icon. This takes care of all the requirements that we needed as far as RPS version 2. Of course, there's so much more that the grid can do, and I recommend trying out all the different examples that you get in the documentation and the demo site.